We are beginning this week the book of Bamidbar Sinai, the book which, the desert of Sinai, but it's known in our tradition as Chomesh HaPekudim, the book of Numbers. And it's called the book of Numbers because the book of Bamidbar has two different senses that are taken. There's one census that begins in the beginning of the book, and there's a second census that is found in chapter 26 of the book. The two census, as the Netziv pointed out, are related to two different generations. The first census being the generation that left Egypt, the slaves, and the second generation, chapter 26, is their children, the first generation having died in the desert. And the second census is in chapter 26, preparatory to possessing the land. What's interesting is that in both of the census, the Torah emphasizes that the Leviim, the Levites, are not counted amongst the people. Now in the second census, there's a specific reason that is given, and that is that these Leviim do not actually possess land. They don't have their own land. They're given land by the other tribes, but they're not involved in the division of land, which is described later in the book of Bamidbar. What's curious is that the first census as well, the Torah emphasizes strongly in more than one place in this week's Torah reading that the Leviim are not to be counted with the others, but it actually never gives a reason as to why the Leviim are counted separately. For example, in the end of chapter 2, "V'halviyim lo hatpakdu b'toch b'nei Yisrael, kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe," but the Levites were not numbered among the children of Israel, as the Lord had commanded Moshe. So what actually is the reason that the Leviim are counted separately in the beginning of our book in this week's Sedra? And it would appear that the answer to that question revolves around the very word to count. Chomesh HaPekudim, pakad. The word pakad has several different meanings. One is to count. But another meaning of pakad is related to being given a particular task. Hafkedo halviyim, the Leviim have specific tasks. Their tasks are to transport the sanctuary in the desert, and the Leviim themselves are divided into three different groups, each having a separate task. So it would appear that the task and the counting are very much connected to each other. The Leviim have a different task. And the reason the Leviim have been singled out for a different task, although it's not specifically mentioned in this week's Sedra, but of course the parasha plays off the earlier story of the Torah, the story of the golden calf, where the Leviim were those that came to Moshe, and there was a great civil war. Those who created the golden calf, worshipped the golden calf, the instigators, were joined in battle by the Leviim, and many died, 3,000 died. And as a result of that, of the Leviim fighting against those who made the golden calf, two things happened. One is they were chosen for specific tasks, specifically to guard the Mishkan. And secondly, they actually live in a different place. The book of Bamidbar emphasizes not just the task, but the place. They live separately. One might say that in a certain sense they're exiled. They're not part of the people. If you kill your brother, kill your sister, you go into exile. In this particular case, the war is a justified war. On the other hand, they did engage in a civil war. As a result of that, the Leviim on one hand are separated from the others. On the other hand, they're closer to God in a sense, and in fact their role becomes to guard the temple. So the word pakad then, the counting of the Leviim separately, should be seen as related to the earlier story. They didn't join with the others in the golden calf, and therefore they're counted separately. They're also given a separate task. The word pakad means to count, the word pakad means to assign a task. But pakad actually has another meaning, which is very much related, and that is the idea of judgment. Memory and specifically judgment. It's interesting that in the book of Bamidbar, when the first generation fails to enter the land, story of the spies in chapters 13 and 14 of this book. And the Torah says a strange thing. In chapter 14, when the Torah says that the first generation will not enter the land, but their children will someday enter the land, Moshe had prayed to God to spare the first generation, because after the episode of the spies, God was very angry. And what's interesting are the verses that we find in chapter 14. God informs Moshe that the first generation will die in the desert. Chapter 14, verse 29, Bamidbar hazeh yiplu pigreichem v'chol pekudechem v'chol misparchem miben esrim shana v'mala asher harinotem alai. In this wilderness, your carcasses will fall, all that were numbered of you, pekudechem, according to your numberings, misparchem, from 20 years old and upward. The Torah makes reference to the very beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, to the counting. To be counted means to be held accountable. The idea of judgment is deeply connected to the idea of being counted. Inclusion in the book of Bamidbar means taking responsibility. So therefore, pakad means to count. Pakad means to be assigned the task. When one is assigned the task, one takes responsibility for the task. The book of Bamidbar is about two generations. The first generation, which leaves the land of Egypt, they were able to leave, took the first great step. They were not able to fully assume responsibility for their task. The second generation picks up when the first generation leaves off. We have the second census, and those will be the generation. That will be the generation that is able to take responsibility, never having been slaves, moves forward in the desert, and ultimately to possess the land. Shabbat Shalom.